What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode. Today's video is going to be all about B-roll. So I'm going to go over what is it, how to get it, and why would you want to use it.
I'm going to use the drift method. Freaking incredible. Round F16 for that to get that sunburst.
Alright, so let's talk about some B-roll. First of all, what is it? Well, in my mind, there's two types of B-roll. So there's the traditional type, which came from cinema and Hollywood and movies and documentaries and all that kind of stuff, where you use B-roll, you use clips to transition the audience from pieces of the story to the next part of the story, or to transition one part of the script to the next part of the script, or things like establishing shots and walking and driving and all that kind of stuff in the movies. So B-roll is not, in that sense, it's not very much. You know, you always see it in real short clips. There's not that much of it because movies have a purpose and they have stories. But then there's the second kind of B-roll, and that is what it's kind of evolving into for us in the YouTube world, and that's the cool cinematic B-roll YouTube epicness. And that has two purposes in itself. So the first purpose is the same purpose as the cinematic world and the film world and all that stuff. We use B-roll to transition. We use B-roll to break up talking heads like myself. So we use it in that sense, but we also use it, we've also come to use it, it's also evolving into more of an entertainment type of thing. So a lot of my videos you'll see intro B-roll and outro B-roll, or longer sections of B-roll. B-roll that's more than 20 seconds. B-roll that is, 20 seconds to a minute long. That is purely for your entertainment. I do that to break up my talking headness, but I also do it because I can, and it looks cool and people like it, so it's trending, so gotta roll with the times. So those are the what's of B-roll and where it came from and where it's going and all that kind of stuff. So now I'm going to give you guys some tips on how to do it, kind of some settings and all that good stuff, and the whys and the wheres and the cuts and the edits and the technical stuff. But first, I need to make some tea because I'm parched out here. And I brought my handy dandy jet boil like I always do. There's nothing better than warm tea, birding, and making YouTube videos. Of course, the birding is a side habit for me, but I do it pretty much everywhere. Alright, so now that you watched me make tea for however long that was, hopefully not too long, let's talk about how I did that, and we'll break it down and give you some tips and go over some settings and stuff. I guess we'll hand the tea over to the camera lady. Good God, your hands were freezing. There's like a frozen air pocket around you. I could... in it. Oh, jeez. Alright, so the first thing about B-roll, and these are all just like to me, but these are all guidelines and all that stuff, just established rules. The first thing that's most important to me is frame rate. So if you want to take video seriously and you want to take making movies or making documentaries or YouTube videos or whatever seriously, then you need to be filming in cinematic acceptable frame rates, which is 24 frames per second, and that is for the normal stuff. So this stuff you see me, the talking head stuff, all of the real-time stuff, 24 frames a second is your happiness place. If you're in Europe, then and you're in PAL or whatever, if you're outside the US, 25 frames a second is the standard for them. But Hollywood uses 24 frames a second. So every movie that you see is 24 frames a second, 23.976 to be precise. And then building on that, if you want to do slow motion, which is the next tip for B-roll, making cinematic B-roll, slow motion is super popular. It adds a lot of creativity, it adds a lot of different things you can do with it. But when you film in slow motion and you slow it down, the goal is to slow it down to That's right, 24 frames per second. So if I film at 60 frames per second and I'm following my 180-degree rule and I have my shutter speed at 1/120th of a second, then when I slow it down, I can either transcode it and say play this clip back at 24 frames a second, or I can say 40%, because 40%, play it back at 40% speed, which is 24 frames a second, coming from 60. So you could do that with 120. I use the Canon 1DX Mark II, which does film in 1080 120, so 120 frames a second. It slows it down by default, so it bakes it in slow motion, so that when I put it in to the timeline, it will play it back at 30 frames a second, which is super slow, but then you can slow it down just a tad bit more, another 15% or something, to get it to 24 frames a second. But it's already baked in that slow motion. So all that stuff that you saw that was slow motion on here, from, I don't know why I'm pointing over there, to my T, where my T should be, all of that stuff was filmed at 1080, 120 frames a second at a shutter speed of 250th of a second. Because remember, using the 180-degree rule, you want a shutter speed that is double your frame rate. So my frame rate was 120 frames per second, and my shutter speed then is 250th of a second. All right, so that's frame rate. That is by far the easiest and most important thing you can do for getting good looking footage no matter what you're doing. All right, so let's talk about actually filming things. So the act of actually filming, and the importance there is motion. Anytime you can get some sort of motion into your B-roll sequence or your video project in general is probably going to be a good thing. Now, having said that, I'm not saying to just always be moving constantly and having it on sliders and having drones and having jibs and all that stuff. That's the next part, is shooting with intent and shooting that motion with intent and knowing what kind of angles you want and how you're going to be moving the camera. All right, so let's talk about some kinds of motion. So not just, the first way is actually moving your camera. The most typical ways you see are going to be panning. So we're going laterally, side to side, we're going up and down, and then tilting. So we're going up on this axis, and then you can of course put those together if you have, you know, sliders and jibs and glide cams and all that stuff. So another kind of motion is focus racking. So basically you're changing, that's not the focus, that's the zoom. So you're changing the focus, you're shifting what you want your audience to see and what is in focus and what's not in focus in the frame. And that really helps selectively push your audience's eyes to what you want them to see. And then the last type of motion is the subject is moving. So if you have the camera locked down, maybe try to have the subject be moving, whether it's somebody walking by or cars driving or time lapse. Those are all great for subjects moving. All right, so going along with motion, ways to get that motion. So normally I use a glide cam. So I actually don't have it with me because it's in my car, but you know what a glide cam is. That's what I use. You can use gimbals. Like the DJI Ronin S is definitely the gimbal that I recommend. The Zhiyun Crane 2, that thing is great. Whatever the gimbal is, they stabilizers of some sort. Those are really great for the walking shots. Those are really great for getting that dynamic motion and panning around your subject and circling and all that cool stuff. I also have some sliders. Sometimes I use sliders. I use those more in time lapses though, but a slider is just back and forth, up and down. You can angle it. You can do some cool stuff with sliders if you don't have gimbal, and sliders are often a little bit cheaper than gimbals. And then of course there's the tripod. Tripods are always handy. If you have a fluid head with a tripod, then you can do panning and tilting and get your static shots and all that stuff. So those are the types of things that I would use to get the motion. And then of course drones, you know what drones do, and you can be creative with drones too. You can even use the drones for lower angles. You can flip the gimbals upside down and get those lower angles, you know, that kind of stuff. So be creative with your motion. Go for those unique angles. Go for the angles that help your storytelling. One more thing about shooting in general and post and thinking with intent and all that stuff is shoot in 4K if you can, or shoot larger than you might need if you know you want to add motion in post. So I just talked about the motion and all of that stuff and getting the glide cams and using the drones and the gimbals and all that stuff. But if you don't have any of that, you can fake it, and you can do it in post if you shoot in 4K and then you edit in 1080p while 4K is 4 times the size of 1080p, so you have a lot of room to move that image around and create that pan or create that tilt or create that zoom in post. So if you need to and you think about it, shoot with intent, shoot with 4K if you know that you want to add some of that motion. So if you don't have any of that stuff though, and you want to shoot handheld, a lot of what Brittany and I do is handheld, especially Brittany because she's not really strong enough to consistently do the glide cam because she's about this tall. But for seriously though, if you don't have anything like that, or if you're not strong enough to use it or whatever, shoot slow motion. That's one of the reasons that we do shoot slow motion, is because it's a lot more forgiving and it's a lot easier to stabilize in post with warp stabilizer in smoothing that out. So Brittany's able to really move consistently and smooth enough that warp stabilizer can still bring that out, especially when we slow it down, and that helps a lot. So that's another reason we shoot slow motion, is if we don't have anything and we're just going run and gun, handheld, use the strap, put it around your neck, get that brace, make your camera heavy, add a handle to the top of your camera, you know, one of those little hot shoe handles that you can slip in. Those things are fantastic, all for helping you smooth out, because weight in this case is your friend. So my 1DX2 is fantastic for hand holding compared to my 5D4, because the 5D4 is really small and jittery and shaky, and the 1DX2 has a lot more bulk to it. All right, so the next big step after you've filmed everything and you've taken all that in consideration is in the editing. And the editing is just as important as the filming in terms of turning it into a story and showcasing it how you want to show it. And color grading is a very good step in that. The color, again, comes down to mood and feeling and everything. Color is very psychological, and our minds are affected by color. So keep color in mind if you're going for something. That Stellar's J Rhett. So keep color in mind and understand how it affects your audience. So if you're going for something light and bouncy and it's a beautiful day and all that stuff, then you might want a color grade that is more saturated and less gloomy and warmer in feeling. So that kind of conveys that. If you're going for something that's scary or edgy or depressing or moody or dark or whatever, you might want more blues, more greens to the tints, that kind of thing. Those are the types of things to think about when you're color grading. Complementary colors, again, if you want to know more about complementary colors, I did a whole video on shooting complementary colors. It's more for photography, but it's the principles of art. So you can check that out if you want to know more about complementary colors. So along with editing comes pacing. Pacing is one of the most important things you can do in the editing suite, and that is how you're cutting your edits. So each clip needs to be how long to fit the pacing of, if you know, well, this entire B-roll clip is going to be a minute long, so I've got some room. You know, do I need to put in a lot of really fast cuts, or do I need to put in a couple of cuts that are a bit longer to really show a certain process? If you're having those quick transitionary B-roll type moments when you're going from scene to scene, then you're probably going to want some faster paced cuts. That's also going to help keep your audience engaged, is having the right pacing. The next most important thing, and this is just as important, I keep saying that, like it feels like nothing is not important, you know what I mean? So the next most important thing is audio, and this really, really is like the most important thing that you can do, because your eyes are much more forgiving than your ears. You can watch the worst, crappiest, visually put together movie ever, but if it sounds great, you will be able to handle it much more than if it was the opposite. If you watch Lord of the Rings and they just forgot to do good audio, and it's just like from a cell phone, you know, clashing, and you're gonna walk out in like 5 seconds, you know. So audio is super important, both when you're filming in here, and then the other part that a lot of people forget is sound effects. Not that bird. That bird is real, and he's driving me nuts. He's gonna get shot in the face. But sound effects, real sound effects. So Foley sounds, whatever you're doing to showcase in your B-roll, think about the sounds that come naturally with that first off, so that you can accentuate those. If you've got footsteps in the ground, if you've got cars driving by, if you've got a bell ringing when you walk into a door, any kind of stuff like that, think about those sounds naturally and try to capture them so that you can include them. Yeah, they do this to me a lot. They know I put my camera down. And then you can also then add into unnatural sounds. So there are sounds that we use for transitions that help transition, and those are like the swooshes and the extra sounds. Sometimes we add in like unnatural wind sounds or helicopter sounds for drones, or all of that kind of stuff. Those are called Foley sounds. Those are very important, and sometimes they're very subtle, but if you don't have them there, you kind of feel like, I don't know, the visuals are just lacking a little bit. I don't know why. But then when you hear that amazing sound, that B-roll sequence of all of this sound going on, and it just fits and it enriches. That's the word I was looking for. It enriches the entire sequence, and it really helps uplift the visuals. So sound, both recording the audio in camera or on location, and then the additional sounds that you can do in post, and that includes your music. So the music is the next part. You got to make sure you have music that fits your cut, that fits your pacing, that fits your story. Those are all super important. So what I like to do is, everybody's different, but this is how I do it. This is how I operate. So I have a general idea in my head, especially when we're filming, and Brittany works with me a lot, and she films a lot of my B-roll. So we kind of get together and we say, well, this is the story we're going to tell with the B-roll. These are the shots that we need, and we have an idea, right? And then I take all of that into Premiere, and I start pulling it in and getting all the good cuts, and this clip's good, this clip's good, this clip's good. As I'm doing that, I'm thinking about my pacing. I know, well, this sequence needs to be maybe 30 seconds long. So I know that I'm going to need something audio-wise that's about 30 seconds long. Then I go over to, I use Epidemic Sound. This is not sponsored in any way by them or anything. That's who I use. And they have a great library of stuff. And I go and you can search by mood, you can search by a lot of different things, and I'll put in my search criterias, and then I'll just start listening to stuff, and usually I'll let that play in the background, and then I'll keep editing. And then if I find something that fits, I go save it and I drag it in, and then I start cutting the pacing, then I start cutting the clips to that sound, and I'll go through and see where are there snare drums, where are the beats, where are the changes in the audio that I can naturally put a clip change. So 2 clips, cut them together, put them right on that beat, that kind of stuff. That is a natural transition that goes with the editing and with the pacing of the music that you're choosing. So if you don't do any other thing else, any other fancy transitions or fancy Foley sounds or anything like that, pacing and editing to your music. So however you get there, whether you have the music picked out first or whatever, editing to your music is the best thing you can do if it's the only thing that you do. So the last thing in the editing suite that I would say, if you want really cinematic looking, what we now consider cinematic looking, is adding those black bars. And when you see me bring my black bars down, the B-roll's coming, that's cinematic because it's emulating the anamorphic lenses that you see in movies. So if you want to know how to do black bars, I have a whole video on that right here. It's super simple. You can check that out. If you're going to be adding black bars, the last thing I would say is shoot wider than you need to when you're shooting in camera, because adding the black bars is going to crop a certain amount off the top and a certain amount off the bottom. So shoot a little wider than you think you need, and then you'll be able to add those black bars in and get beautiful cinematic footage. Alright, so I'm going to wrap it up. I know that was probably really long, but if you guys watch my channel, you're probably used to that. And if you haven't watched my channel and you want to stick around, you should subscribe, because I got new videos every Tuesday and Friday. So if you guys have any questions, though, about anything that I went over or didn't go over concerning this, how to make B-roll and all of that great stuff, leave those in the comments below and I'll definitely answer them. Hit that like button if this video helped you out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. But first, I've got to go shoot some of those birds. There is a Stellar's jay that will not shut up.